When both of you stop contacting each other, what emerges is not peace, not closure, and certainly not emotional balance. What emerges is silence, and silence is never neutral. Psychologically speaking, silence creates a vacuum, and a vacuum always demands to be filled. For the avoidant narcissistic woman, that vacuum is deeply unsettling because her inner world is not self-sustaining. It relies on external regulation, attention, reaction, presence. When that suddenly disappears, the silence does not feel calm. It feels like a loss of gravity. From a Jungian perspective, the ego seeks stability through familiar patterns. In this dynamic, contact was not merely communication. It was a system of power, reassurance, and identity reinforcement. When both sides withdraw, that system collapses. For her, this is experienced not as mutual distance, but as a threat to psychological control. She may appear composed, indifferent, or even empowered, but internally the silence disrupts the narrative she relied on to feel superior, desired, or untouchable. For you, however, the same silence serves a different function. It interrupts emotional dependency. It slows the compulsive need to explain, defend, or seek validation. At first, the quiet can feel uncomfortable, almost wrong, because you were conditioned to equate contact with meaning. But over time, something subtle happens. Your nervous system begins to recalibrate. Thoughts become clearer. Emotions lose their urgency. You start to recognize how much energy was being siphoned away simply to maintain imbalance. This is why the silence feels heavy to one and clarifying to the other. One experiences a collapse of control, the other experiences the return of self. And this is the uncomfortable truth. The moment silence becomes intolerable is the moment it reveals who was feeding on connection and who was losing themselves inside it. Silence doesn't end the dynamic. It exposes it. What most people misunderstand about avoidant narcissistic dynamics is the nature of loss itself. When contact ends, they assume the pain on the other side must be emotional heartbreak, grief, or longing. But for an avoidant narcissistic woman, the primary loss is not love, it is control. Love requires vulnerability, mutual recognition, and the capacity to be affected by another person. Control, on the other hand, allows distance, superiority, and emotional insulation, and it is control that matters most. From a Jungian lens, the narcissistic ego is fragile precisely because it is inflated. It cannot tolerate uncertainty. It cannot sit with the idea that someone may withdraw without explanation, without pursuit, without collapse. When you stop reaching out, you are no longer orbiting her emotional gravity. That destabilizes the internal hierarchy she relied on to feel secure. The fear that arises is not "I've lost someone who mattered," but "I no longer determine the outcome." This is why no contact feels so threatening. Your silence removes her ability to regulate self-worth through reaction. She cannot provoke reassurance, guilt, or admiration. Even conflict, which once served as proof of relevance, disappears. And in that absence, something uncomfortable emerges. A sense of replaceability. The narcissistic mind is structured around being central, unforgettable, and irreplaceable. Losing control over your attention fractures that illusion. Meanwhile, you may still feel emotional residue, confusion, sadness, or nostalgia, but you are no longer reinforcing the imbalance. You are no longer negotiating for understanding. That shift alone begins to reverse the dynamic. Control only exists where participation continues. This is the quiet paradox. The less you try to be understood, the more psychologically untouchable you become. And when control is lost, the mask of indifference cracks. You don't break a narcissistic hold by confronting it. You break it by removing yourself from the equation. When your presence is removed completely, something unusual happens in the psyche of an avoidant narcissistic woman. The external distraction disappears, and what remains is not relief, but confrontation. Without your attention, reactions, or emotional availability, she is left alone with the very inner material she has spent a lifetime avoiding. From a Jungian perspective, this is the moment the shadow steps forward. Avoidant narcissism depends on distance. Distance creates the illusion of strength. It allows unresolved shame, insecurity, and self-doubt to remain unexamined. But your absence removes the stage on which that distance was performed. There is no one to impress, no one to provoke, no one to dominate emotionally, and in that silence the inner contradictions surface. The inflated self-image begins to wobble because it can no longer be reflected back. This internal conflict is rarely conscious. She may rationalize it as independence or emotional detachment, but beneath that story lies discomfort. Questions emerge that have no easy answer. Why does the silence feel heavier than expected? Why doesn't superiority feel satisfying without an audience? These moments create psychological tension, because the persona she presents to the world no longer matches the emotional reality underneath. For you, this internal conflict is invisible. And that's the point. You are no longer participating in the cycle that kept it hidden. Jung spoke of individuation as the process of becoming whole by integrating what we avoid. Your withdrawal forces a fork in the road. Either she turns inward and confronts the shadow, or she seeks another external source to restore equilibrium. Both outcomes confirm the same truth. You are no longer responsible for her inner balance. This is why no contact is so destabilizing. It removes the buffer between ego and reality. When someone can no longer outsource their sense of self, they must finally it. Your absence doesn't punish her. It reveals her. When she doesn't reach out, it's tempting to interpret the silence as indifference or emotional strength. But in avoidant narcissistic dynamics, silence is rarely neutral and almost never accidental. What looks like calm detachment is often a form of strategic withdrawal. It is not the absence of feeling, it is the management of exposure. Engagement would require vulnerability, and vulnerability threatens the carefully maintained image of control. From a Jungian standpoint, the persona exists to protect the ego from being seen too clearly. For the avoidant narcissistic woman, contact carries risk. It risks accountability, it risks emotional reciprocity, it risks the possibility that she might be affected, questioned, or revealed. By withdrawing, she preserves the illusion of self-sufficiency. Silence becomes a shield, not a sign of resolution. This is why her absence can feel confusing. There may have been intensity, conflict, or emotional charge before, and suddenly nothing. But this withdrawal is not closure. It is containment. It allows her to maintain internal order without confronting unresolved dynamics. The moment she speaks, she risks reopening emotional terrain she cannot fully control. Meanwhile, your instinct may be to interpret her silence as a verdict on your worth. That assumption is misplaced. Her withdrawal is about preserving dominance, not processing loss. By not reaching out, she avoids facing quest. Ions she cannot answer honestly, questions about responsibility, emotional impact, and mutuality. This is where the dynamic quietly shifts. When you do not pursue, explain, or re-engage, her silence loses its function. It no longer provokes reaction. It no longer confirms superiority. What was once strategic becomes empty. True strength does not require disappearance to survive contact. When silence is used as armor, it reveals fear, not power. And the moment you stop mistaking withdrawal for indifference is the moment you reclaim your clarity. As contact remains broken, a subtle but decisive shift begins to take place, one that often goes unnoticed until its effects are unmistakable. You begin to regain your sense of identity, not all at once and not dramatically, but through small internal corrections. Your thoughts stop circling the same questions. Your emotions lose their sharp edges. You are no longer measuring your worth against her reactions. This is the quiet return of the self. From a Jungian perspective, Prolonged involvement in imbalanced dynamics fragments identity. You adapt, suppress, and reshape yourself to maintain connection. Over time, the ego becomes organized around anticipation rather than authenticity. No contact interrupts this process. Without the constant stimulus, your psyche begins to reorganize around your own values, instincts, and boundaries. This is not empowerment through force. It is restoration through absence. For her, this same process unfolds in reverse. The avoidant narcissistic woman derives stability from being psychologically central. When you stop orbiting her emotional world, something destabilizing occurs. She is no longer mirrored as exceptional, irreplaceable, or dominant. And that absence creates an unfamiliar sensation, irrelevance, not abandonment, but replaceability. This is deeply threatening to a narcissistic structure built on uniqueness. She may respond by minimizing the connection or amplifying her independence, but these are defenses. The deeper discomfort comes from realizing that her presence is no longer required to shape your inner state. You are no longer responsive in the way that once confirmed her influence. This is why healing often feels selfish at first. You are stepping out of a role that required you to be emotionally available, adaptable, and self-doubting. But individuation demands this withdrawal. You cannot become whole while remaining psychologically contingent on someone else's validation. When one person reclaims identity, the other is forced to confront the limits of their control. And in that contrast, the true power dynamic is revealed. You don't become strong by being chosen again. You become strong by choosing yourself back. When both of you remain in no contact long enough, something profound happens. The dynamic stops being a struggle between two people and becomes a mirror. And this is where many misunderstand no contact, believing it is a tactic meant to provoke regret, remorse, or pursuit. It isn't. At its deepest level, no contact is diagnostic. It reveals truth without argument. From a Jungian perspective, relationships function as projections. We see parts of ourselves reflected, distorted, or denied through the other. When contact ends, the projections fall back onto their owner. You are left to face who you became in the relationship, how much you compromised, how often you doubted yourself, how easily you confused intensity with meaning. That realization can be uncomfortable, but it is also liberating. Awareness is the beginning of individuation. For her, the mirror reflects something different. Without your emotional energy, there is no one to stabilize her internal narrative. The roles dissolve. The power dynamics lose context. What remains is the self as it is, not as it was managed through influence. This is why no contact feels intolerable to some and transformative to others. One is confronted with emptiness, the other with clarity. Importantly, this process is not punishment. Punishment requires intention and aggression. No contact requires restraint. It is the refusal to continue a pattern that no longer aligns with who you are becoming. In that sense, it is an ethical act toward yourself. You stop participating in what distorts you. This is the final shift. You are no longer waiting for understanding, apology, or recognition. You are understanding yourself. And once that happens, the dynamic cannot resume in the same form, even if contact were restored. No contact doesn't end the story. It tells you the truth about it. And once you see clearly, you are no longer bound to repeat what no longer belongs to you.